No one knew for the first 2 weeks in Syria where he had been removed because the US government wouldn't tell people.
Maher Arar was kept in a grave-like cell and tortured for over 10 months. He was then released, and no charges were ever filed against him.
I still have fears. I don't take the plane anymore. I don't fly. I have not been able to find a job. They ruined my life. They ruined my life.
The idea that the president could simply pick up any person in the world and hold them in an offshore prison, hold them forever, is really a shock. And that goes against everything that a legal system or that a democracy or that a republic ever stood for.
Wir haben ein deutsches Theater, einen deutschen Film, eine deutsche Presse, ein deutsches Schrifttum, eine deutsche bildende Kunst und einen deutschen Rundfunk.
The next thing that always happens, the seventh step, is the targeting of key individuals. Goebbels was so good at this. He systematically targeted people who were not in alignment with the regime. So you start to see key individuals, visible individuals, kind of singled out to be punished or have repercussions, career repercussions. You saw people like the Dixie Chicks.
President of the United States.
The Chicks hit Travel and Soldier went from #1 to oblivion in 2 weeks. Replacing it, Daryl Worley's Have You Forgotten, a pro-war song.
It wasn't a local type of thing where people, and there wasn't an aspect of that, but for the most part, it was coming down from the top. You are not allowed to play the Dixie Chicks.
One random comment, they wished Bush wasn't from Texas. Next thing you know, Clear Channel, which has close ties to the White House, is making sure that radio stations are not playing their music.
We don't have a stage and a microphone. All we have is our checkbook when we go pay for the CDs and the tickets and the T-shirts and all the stuff we've paid too much money for.
And then, another one of these echoes, you hear about spontaneous CD burnings of Dixie Chicks CDs all over the South. And you know there's something funny going on with this because CDs don't burn. What does this echo? Book burnings, of course. In April of 1933, Goebbels orchestrated spontaneous book burnings where students were supposed to pile up books by people who were critical of the regime and trash them, set them on fire. You saw people like Dan Rather, a critical report of Bush's service.
CBS News, 60 Minutes, and this reporter drew fire today over our reports that raised questions about President Bush's military service record.
Subsequently, the White House put so much pressure on his employer that Dan Rather now claims in a lawsuit that his employers caved to White House pressure and drove him out of his job.
The central thing here is you can't have freedom of the press if you're going to have large, big corporations and big government intruding and intimidating in newsrooms. The chilling effect of investigative reporting is going to be something we don't want to see.
Many visible people, silent Valerie Plame.
My name and identity were carelessly and recklessly abused by senior government officials in both the White House and the State Department.
She was singled out to punish her husband, who had blown the whistle about the president's lie about yellow cake uranium.
After a CIA-sponsored trip to Africa, her husband, Joe Wilson, wrote this article attacking the rationale for war, that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Dick Cheney was furious, and when he found out Wilson's wife worked at the CIA, he wanted to use her to discredit him.
It's claimed in retaliation, Scooter Libby leaked the fact that Wilson's wife, Valerie Plame, was a CIA operative.
And you're convinced that's why they did it? It's because they didn't like what you were saying?
Well, I actually think that it was more nefarious than that. I think that they were doing it because they had every intention of trying to protect the cover-up of the lies and disinformation that provided the justification for war in the first place.
They purposefully outed a CIA agent, Valerie Plame. That's not treason anymore, outing a spy? Did I mention it was one of our spies?
Did the July 14th column destroy your covert position and your classified status?
Yes, it did. I could no longer perform the work for which I had been highly trained, and so that career path was terminated.
It was her whole career, and her whole career depended on keeping the cover, and they deliberately went out and trashed her.
Valerie Plame, her career ended, her life endangered, those of the people around her endangered. And she says in her memoir that when she went out on her back porch, to look at her back porch rather, and she has 2 toddlers, she saw that the bolts holding the deck up 20 feet off the ground had been loosened. That's right, targeting key individuals.
Prosecute the Times! Prosecute the Times! Prosecute the Times!
The next step a would-be dictator always takes is to restrict the press. Of course, this is really scary, you know, to me, but it should scare all of us.
There can be no excuse for anyone entrusted with vital intelligence to leak it, and no excuse for any newspaper to print it.
Bill Keller, the executive editor of the New York Times, chose to publish a story that revealed that the White House, under the guise of fighting terror, was secretly and illegally monitoring financial transactions through a Belgian telecom company called SWIFT.
Some in the press, in particular the New York Times, have made the job of defending against further terrorist attacks more difficult by insisting on publishing detailed information about vital national security programs.
There was this drumbeat of sound bites from the White House. Treason, treason, treason.
Right-wing pundits and elected officials immediately called for the prosecution of the New York Times and its confidential sources under the Espionage Act.
And I'm calling on the Attorney General to begin a criminal investigation and prosecution of the New York Times, its reporters, the editors that worked on this, and the publisher.
Other pundits used White House sound bites that called for Bill Keller's prosecution on the basis of treason.
Anybody who leaks or publishes classified data in a time of war in a highly successful program such as the SWIFT base, they should be tried for treason. If they were found guilty of treason, I would have no problem with them being executed.
There was this soundbite: prosecute such reporters under the Espionage Act. Prosecute reporters who release classified information under the Espionage Act. Well, anyone who works in journalism knows that up and down New York and Washington, good reporters are transmitting classified information all the time because that's how they do their jobs. This is really scary when you've read the history of closing societies, because what immediately comes to mind is that in 1936 and 37, Nikolai Bukharin, the editor of Izvestia, the equivalent of the New York Times in Russia, was charged with treason by Stalin. He was tried in a kangaroo court in the Third Moscow Show trial and was in fact executed.
The Espionage Act of 1917 was passed in the run-up to the First World War. The Espionage Act basically made it a crime to criticize the war. It equated dissent with espionage.
And what it did was it allowed agents of the state to round up ordinary citizens, librarians, activists, labor leaders, journalists, without warrants. Often these people were beaten, they were imprisoned.
Eugene Debs, a presidential candidate at the time, was sentenced to 10 years in prison under the Espionage Act. His crime? He had given a speech about the